here we are, back again. The wait is over. You're welcome. Let's hop right to it. Zoe and I have spent the last 2 weeks inspecting the dome 1 inch at a time. It's been as thrilling as it sounds. Meet up in the morning, spend 10 hours checking the dome and spray painting red X marks periodically as we continually fail to find a door, encounter a few monsters and fight or chase them off before resuming the search, and eventually meet up in the evening for dinner and talking. Then we either go home or spend the night at each other's place, depending on how long we spend talking. Spoiler alert, we usually have to sleep over because we get so caught up in our discussions that it gets dark. Then do it all over again the next day. That's been my life for the last 2 weeks. Honestly, it's not bad. Spending time with Zoe in the mornings and evenings makes it all worth it. And sure, it gets demoralizing by the 6th hour or so every day, but overall I still feel like I have more of a purpose than I did before. We've covered a lot of ground. We've got to be getting close. Zoe and I have learned a lot about each other too. I can't express enough how nice it is to feel a connection to another person again. She's told me more about her family, her hobbies, her plans for the future. Before this all started, she wanted to get a degree in education and become a teacher, probably an English teacher. She would have helped her dad run the bookstore too, and maybe taken it over someday. She loves animals, sunflowers, and musicals. She was on the debate team in high school and played soccer when she was little. She sleeps with a stuffed blue cat named Delilah every night that she's had since she was a baby. And she's super smart. I won't name what college she'd been accepted to and would have started at last fall for the sake of her privacy, but just know it was a really good one. Better than the one I would have started at. Long story short, she's awesome. And I'm way out of my league here, guys. Anyway, I've told her a lot about myself, too. My parents, my siblings, Justin, my younger brother, and Amber, my older sister. I'm not sure I've actually mentioned her to you guys before, but I did have an older sister. She went to a local community college and worked part-time as an EMT. She still lived at home with us, and, well, things didn't for her the same way they did for the rest of my family. I've told her about my high school basketball team and my plans for college. I wasn't totally decided on my major yet. After writing all these posts, I kind of think journalism would have been a good fit. Maybe if I ever get out of here, I'll do something like that. Even the craziest news stories would seem manageable after what I've written about recently. I told her about my friends, too. Despite all my complaints about people I hated in high school, I also had some really good friends. Nolan, for one. I met him in kindergarten when I staged an epic battle between the dolls and dinosaurs. But I didn't think the dinosaurs should have an easy victory, so the dolls had magic powers. And one of them with super strength kicked a triceratops, and to represent the force, I obviously had to throw the triceratops across the room. It hit Nolan in the head, and after that playing Dino Wars became even more fun, because he played with me. Nolan played basketball with me in high school too, and he was the best friend I ever had. Yes, I did try looking for him after my family died. I hoped maybe he'd still be alive. But when I got to his house, I found his parents dead, and he and his brother were nowhere to be seen. I looked for them on and off for months, and I tried calling him regularly, but I never got a response. Finally, I had to assume they were dead. All this to say that Zoe and I have talked about so much. She's really great. The more I get to know her, the more I like her. Thank God that the one person I found still alive is someone I get along with so well. Can you imagine if I finally found another human and it was someone like Caleb? I'd rather be alone forever. I'd rather walk out into the street and let a monster, any monster, kill me, as brutally as they'd like. Even a horrific, organs ripped out death would be better than another minute with Caleb. Fuck Caleb. So, that's been my last 2 weeks. Well, until yesterday, because yesterday, things got interesting. See, it was the afternoon, and I'd been hard at work examining the dome for 6 hours or so. It was about the time in the day that things start to feel hopeless and pointless since, 1, it feels like I've been checking the dome and drawing X marks forever, and 2, despite it being forever since the morning, there's still somehow hours until I get to spend time with Zoe. Oh, and because there's been no sign of the door, obviously. Well, as I was leaning down and drawing another X, there was a crackling from my walkie-talkie hooked onto my belt. I immediately dropped the spray paint and held the walkie-talkie up to my ear because their signal is terrible. Better than cell phone reception, but still terrible. And I didn't want to miss whatever Zoe was trying to tell me. Yes, Zoe and I got walkie-talkies to communicate, and it's a good thing we did, because we've used them to get to each other and help with monster attacks more than once. I figured it was a monster, and I needed to hear what she said to know where to go and what weapon to have ready. Or maybe it was just her getting bored and telling me a riddle. Sometimes she did that, keeping herself amused by calling and telling me riddles that stumped me so hard that she eventually gave in and told me the answer. Hey, either reason for the call would be a break from monotony. But for the first time ever, it wasn't either of those. Her voice crackled over the walkie-talkie, full of static but coming through just clear enough to decipher at least some of the words. Holy shit. Eli. Found it. Come quick. Found. Door. Maple. Which, filling in the gap, sure seemed like she'd found the door in the dome. My heart leapt in excitement. "This is it," I said to Mr. Bailey, who'd been sitting at my feet, keeping an eye out behind me while my back was turned. He's a fantastic watch cat. Not saying that watch dogs suck, but you haven't seen the true potential of a watch animal until you've had a cat like Mr. B instead. Sorry, German Shepherds, it's the cold hard truth. I put the walkie-talkie back into its little holster in my belt, let Mr. B jump up onto my shoulder, and took off running. I could have sworn her last intelligible word was Maple, and there was a Maple Drive in the part of the city she'd been going to today. I'd beeline for that street and hope she was nearby. Now, keep in mind that we were actually pretty far apart, because we'd been working outwards from where she'd started on the dome, one of us heading in each direction. After 2 weeks, we were miles apart, which is good, because we'd been making real progress, but also bad, because it's a hell of a long way to move in a hurry. I won't lie to you, I only ran for a few blocks before I slowed to a brisk walk. I wasn't about to waste my energy sprinting when I wasn't running for my life, especially because I'd stashed a bike not too far away. A couple of days after starting the system, we'd realized we'd soon be pretty spread out, so we went to a sporting goods store and borrowed 2 bikes. We always rode them to our starting point for the day, then walked back to them and rode back to my house or the bookstore. It's a pretty good system, honestly. You can be awed by our genius, I'm fine with that. Luckily, I got to my bike without incident. I hopped on, and Mr. Bailey climbed down from my shoulder to take his usual spot in the basket, because yes, I picked him with a basket specifically for Mr. B. Don't judge a man for loving his cat. And we took off. Biking is a lot faster than running, particularly me running. Highly recommend. Even sticking to back roads and alleys as much as possible in the hopes of avoiding monsters, it didn't take me long to get to the right part of the city. Unfortunately, that's where things went wrong. Nothing can be too easy after all. I was probably 4 blocks or so away from Maple Drive when suddenly I heard Zoe calling my name. She sounded scared, in pain. My heart almost stopped. I started to pedal harder, thinking I had to pick up the pace since a monster must have found her. But a second later I skidded to a stop instead, because there she was, stumbling around the corner covered in blood. I think my heart did stop that time. I slammed on the brakes so hard that Mr. B meowed in protest and dug his claws in to keep from being flung out of the basket. "Zoe! Oh fuck, Zoe, are you okay?" I called, practically jumping off the bike while it was still moving. I hit my shin on the handlebars as I messily leapt across them and knew I'd have a bruise there by the morning, but there were more important things to worry about right now, namely, Zoe. "Eli, thank God you're here. Oh, Eli, it was awful," she sobbed. Her hair was a mess, her clothes were dirty and torn. The gloves she liked to wear for inspecting the dome, she didn't want to risk compromising any evidence, her words, were soaked in blood, as was her shirt. There were even flecks of blood on her glasses. And she was crying. Even in all the emotional things we discussed, I hadn't seen her cry, until now. I hated it. Seeing her in pain made me want to cry. "What happened?" I asked, frantic as I reached her and wrapped my arms around her, just in time for her legs to give out. I supported her and slowly sank to the ground. We ended up on the road, me sitting and her sprawled out, her upper half on my lap. Blood was already soaking onto my jeans. There was so much that I couldn't even tell where it was originating from. "Tell me what happened," I begged. "Are you okay? You don't look okay. Oh God, Zoe, I don't know how to help you." She looked up at me. "Monsters. I think they heard me on the walkie-talkie. I was waiting for you to get here, and suddenly there were so many of them. I tried to fight, but there were so many. I couldn't get them all." She gave a little laugh, but it turned into a wheeze, and a drop of blood appeared at her lips. I looked around frantically. "Where's Waffles? He can carry you. We can get you back to the bookstore. You'll be okay. You have to be." There was a pit in my stomach the size of a planet, and I was afraid it might consume me. I couldn't lose her. I wouldn't. She had first aid supplies at the bookstore. She'd shown me her stash. If we could just make it there, I could figure out enough to keep her alive, at least. She'd done the same for me after the concert hall. She shook her head. "He didn't make it. He died defending me. It almost worked, too." The pit grew larger. It was like a cold, deep black hole. Not in a Mike way, but in a pit of dread and depression and fear that might destroy me kind of way. I was struggling to think clearly, and Mr. Billy was meowing his head off next to me, which was not helping. Okay. Where are you hurt? I'll use my jacket to cover it and help it clot, and then I'll carry you back to the store. And it won't be as fast, but we'll get there, and you'll be fine." Zoe shook her head again. I can walk. Give me a minute." My heart lurched as she slowly pushed herself off my lap and struggled to her feet, wheezing the whole time. She put one hand over her abdomen, moaning as she applied pressure to whatever wound was there under the blood, and tried to start walking. She made it only a few steps before she stumbled again and started to fall. I lunged forward and caught her, sinking back to the ground as I had the first time. She chuckled. "Okay, Sumi. I was wrong. I don't think I can walk." Tears were forming in my eyes, and I couldn't even form a coherent sentence. There was so much I wanted to say, and yet I couldn't string anything together. "Zoe, oh God, Zoe. Please, no. Zoe." Mr. Bailey was still meowing his head off, bumping into me and circling. Little alarm bells at the back of my mind told me I should pay attention to him, but the rest of my brain told it to shut up, because here was Zoe, her head in my lap, and she was probably dying. She looked up at me and smiled weakly. One hand was still on her abdomen, and the other she raised and offered to me. The black glove was slick with her blood. Tears were streaming down her face. "It's okay, Eli. I'll be okay. You can do one thing for me, though." "Anything," I said, choking on even the single word. Her eyes seemed to sparkle, wet with tears. "Just take my hand. Hold it until the end, so that I know you're really here." Mr. Bailey's meows got louder. I wouldn't have said it was possible since they were already so loud, but they did, as I reached to take her hand. And then right before I took it, he jumped in between us and clawed the hell out of my arm. I jerked back, shocked and worried that he'd hurt Zoe, and said, "What the hell?" Before he could respond, I saw movement out of the corner of my eye. I would have just said fuck it and turned back to Zoe, because I still had things I needed to say, and because if she was dying, maybe I should just let myself die too, so that I wouldn't have to deal with heartbreak all over again. But something about the movements looked familiar. So I looked up instead. And there, standing 10 feet away, axe in hand, was Zoe? "Get away from him, you motherfucker!" she screamed. Still reeling emotionally and trying to figure out what was going on, I looked back down at the Zoe in my lap in shock. She was crying again. "Don't listen to her, she's a fake," she sobbed. "You have to help me, please." Other Zoe was moving closer. "Eli, it's me. That's oh Jesus, what did you call him again? Oh, I've got it. That's an MJ. It's not me. Look, I'm fine." I wanted it to be true, obviously, because that would mean Zoe wasn't in danger of dying. But you have to understand that this was in the moment, and my emotions were on a fucking roller coaster, and everything seemed so confusing. Both Zoes started talking at once, and Mr. Bailey was meowing, and the Zoe in my lap reached out her hand to me again, begging me to comfort her as she died, and my head was spinning, fitting puzzle pieces together, trying to think rationally, and 3 things made it click. 1. Mr. Bailey's crazed behavior since the first Zoe had appeared, including jumping between us before I could accept her hand. 2. The fact that the Zoe in my lap had been offering me her hand at all, and that she'd used the words, "just take my hand," which is literally the hallmark of MJ. If you caught it earlier, congrats, you're smarter than me, now shut up. And 3. Waffles walked up behind the second Zoe at that moment, which meant that she was the real Zoe, because since she was with Waffles, and since Waffles was clearly alive and well, despite the MJ Zoe in my lap claiming she was dead. I shoved MJ Zoe off my lap and jumped to my feet, rubbing my tears away with my sleeve. "Fuck you," I told it. It laughed. "So close," it said. "We know how to get you now. Your weakness is obvious." Its eyes flicked to Zoe, who by now was standing beside me. "She won't always get here in time." "Well, I did this time, bitch," said Zoe, and then she raised her axe and obliterated its head with 27 swings, one after the other, like she was topping down a tree. I counted the axe strokes. It was kind of comforting somehow. Once it was over, she pulled the bloody axe out and held it at her side. She looked back to me, and I swear no one had ever looked more beautiful than she did in that moment. Hair in her face, monster blood sprayed across her clothes, and most importantly, alive and uninjured. "Are you okay?" she asked. I laughed shakily. "I am now," I said. "God, I was just so scared of you dying that I ignored all the signs." As if to agree, Mr. Bailey meowed in annoyance. "Sorry, buddy," I added, leaning down to scratch his back. "You were right, as usual." He purred. Zoe came over to me and placed her hand on my arm. "I get it," she said quietly. "I would have too, if it was you." She looked down at the dead MJ thoughtfully. "You know, maybe I should stop wearing gloves." I laughed, a little less shakily this time. "Yeah, I think you should." We started to walk together. She handed me her axe so that she could take off her gloves, one hand at a time, and leave them lying there on the street. Grinning, she flipped me a double bird before taking it back. "If we're keeping count, I'm pretty sure we're at 2-0 in favor of me saving your life versus you saving mine. 3-0 if you count sending Waffles. So, get moving." "Shit, I'll see what I can do," I said, smiling. My heart was finally beginning to beat normally again. I wouldn't have traded having another person for anything, but I didn't like that the MJs had someone alive to use against me now. I hadn't even thought of that. This was the first time it had happened. It worried me, because as MJ Zoe had just proven, it was clearly my Achilles heel. And though it had almost killed me, I knew I would do it again in a second if I truly thought it was Zoe, because I cared about her. A lot. By this time, we'd reached Maple Drive. Zoe quickened her pace in excitement, leading me down the street to the dome. "Luckily, I have good news to make up for what just happened," she said. "Come on, come on!" I followed her and pushed the encounter to the back of my mind. I could worry and cry over it later. Right now, Zoe was here, and she'd found the door. We'd quite possibly found the way out. Perhaps in a few minutes this would all be over and I'd never have to meet another MJ again. Perhaps that was their last-ditch attempt to kill me because they knew they wouldn't get another chance. We stood in front of the dome, Mr. Bailey back on my shoulder and Waffles at Zoe's side. "It's here," she said quietly, almost reverently. "I waited for you before I went in. Do you think this is really it?" "God, I hope so," I said. There was a long pause. Then I said, "I'm glad I'm not here alone." "Me too," she said. Another long pause. Okay, I finally said. Well, you found it. You do the honors. She looked at me, reached out and squeezed my hand, and then took the final step forward to touch the dome. She pushed, hard, and I watched the rectangular portion of the dome swung inwards, revealing not the outside world, but a room. We looked at each other quizzically and simultaneously seemed to agree to go in. I mean, duh. All that work to find it and we weren't gonna go in? Yeah, right. Waffles couldn't have fit through the door if he tried. He stayed outside to guard the door. Zoe went in and I followed suit, a half step behind, because like hell was I letting her go in alone. It took a minute for our eyes to adjust. There were light panels in the ceiling, but they were much dimmer than the sunlight outside. Once they did, we found ourselves in a concrete room, completely empty except for a single wooden table in the far corner. And on that table was a slip of paper. I walked over to it and picked up the slip, and my heart sank. I read it aloud to Zoe. Admirable effort, but this isn't what you're looking for. Stop trying to find a way out, or you'll find out what we can really do. You think it's bad now, but it can get so much worse. Stop trying, unless you want to find out what we mean. We still searched every single inch of that room, of course, hoping for a hidden door or something. I mean it. We spent several hours inspecting and re-inspecting every nook and cranny of that single room. But there was nothing except that paper. Finally, we gave up and left when there was just enough time to get back to the bookstore before it got dark. Thankfully, we didn't run into any monsters on the way. My emotional state was nowhere near stable enough to handle another encounter after everything that had happened that afternoon. I would have self-destructed. That evening, Zoe and I talked in our soundproof room. There's gotta be another place where the monsters are being sent in, said Zoe. Waffles remembers a room, and shaking, and then emerging into the city. I'll just have to talk to him again and see if he remembers anything else helpful. Maybe there's another door. Maybe, I said. We'll keep trying. But that's a problem for the morning. I basically saw you die today, and I almost died too. I need to sleep. I got up and started to walk toward the door. Zoe cleared her throat behind me, and I half-turned, my hand on the knob. I was just thinking. You don't have to sleep in the chair downstairs. You could sleep in here. You know, if you want to. Maybe it would help remind you that I'm alive and that today wasn't real. Maybe it would, I agreed, and instead of a pit in my stomach, there were butterflies. And that's how I ended up sleeping beside Zoe on the mattress last night, her head on my chest and Mr. Bailey at our feet. No, nothing happened. By sleeping, I mean just sleeping. But it really did remind me that she was still here. I didn't even have any nightmares. In fact, I think it was one of the best nights of sleep I've gotten since this all started. As for our escape, looks like it's back to the drawing board. We'll be talking to Waffles to try to figure out any leads about where the monsters enter. This is a setback, but we won't be giving up that easily. Whoever wrote that note isn't going to deter us by fear. We've made it this far. One threatening note doesn't scare us anymore. Well, not that much anyway. At least I know that whatever happens, I'll be doing it with Zoe. Thank God for that.